I kind of wanted to start off by talking about how she opened the book with her illness, childhood illness, diabetes. It's very rare that children are like plagued with such a almost an adult disease. I know that you can get diabetes at any stage in your life, but a lot of the times diabetes comes after you develop certain eating habits. And I think that her kind of opening this memoir with the diabetes that she had to suffer with as a child was really powerful and very interesting. The scene where she's listening to her parents argue about who is going to inject her with the insulin, and then figuring out like, okay, you know what, I'm just gonna have to do it myself, at 7 years old. It almost seems like that set the stage, if you will, for her trajectory in life. Like, okay, you know what, I'm not gonna be able to depend on a bunch of people here. I might just have to do this myself. And I think learning that at such a young age, 7, I think she said she was 7 or 8. I can't imagine having to, and I know this was, I believe in the late 50s, early 60s, and technology, well, a good friend of mine actually had childhood diabetes, and technology is much more sophisticated now. He actually, it's like a very small device that he carries with him to check his blood sugar, and he has his insulin that's just kind of always attached to him. He's never really had to suffer with the needles. And I can't imagine as a child having to inject yourself with insulin, like with a needle so big. And I think it was so brave for her to kind of open up with that, because it would almost, I want to hear what y'all think about that. And if anyone has any personal stories you want to share, let's definitely hear them. But like that idea of kind of sharing that disease would almost be like a way to evoke a lot of sympathy. But I feel like the way that it's written, maybe this was just me, the way that it's written, the way that I read it, it made her a lot stronger. It didn't make me feel sorry for her at all. It made me feel like, whoa, this girl is strong. This woman is smart. This child is like going to get through this. They're extraordinarily observant and is going to get through this. I don't have to worry about her at all. The way that it was written, it was almost like, oh, okay, she'll be fine. She's gonna be fine in life. Even though she has childhood diabetes, I'm really not worried about her. It really didn't, she kind of started off like with at that level, at that stage of like, don't feel bad for me. Like I'm going all the way up, like I'm gonna introduce you to this very low point of my life and kind of these difficult cards that I was played, but like, it's definitely not a sob story. Do y'all know what I'm saying? She really set the stage at that level.
I actually had the opposite impression, to tell you the truth. And I think that's just based on experience, because I have a very good friend who was diagnosed with diabetes. I think we were in 3rd or 4th grade. And we're talking about the mid to early 80s. And even then it was a very big deal. Like she was literally in the hospital for about a month. And her family had a history of diabetes. So I think because I have, I vividly recall it, I have a different impression. I think until I got older is when I realized, there are different type of diabetes, and my mom is diabetic, but she doesn't take insulin. But growing up, to me, it was given. You had to take needles, and it was a big impact to my friend's family. But I think what the diabetes, to a certain extent, was more of the background. What resonated more with me was the dynamic of the relationship of her parents, in particular, her father, right? And his struggles and the alcoholism. And as you get further into the story, we hear we don't get to know him that well, but we have enough of an impression about him and how that relationship also influenced, to me, how her relationship with her mother and how she viewed her mother. So to me, it was more the diabetes was a factor. It was almost like you have a circle, you have all these bubbles that are impacting you. But to me, what was more impressionable was the relationship that her parents had in the time that she was dealing with a serious illness in 1962 and what that meant in 1962 to have diabetes. So it could have been a different type of disease, but it was more to me like her parents and her father and that relationship and what that meant as she had to deal with this disease being as young as she was.
And, I just think that what you said is just like dead on because, not for nothing, but y'all, her mom was a nurse. Her mom was a full-time nurse, So like what Myra kind of just articulated, can you imagine having that level of a disease and your mom is a full-time nurse? It's not like she worked at a retail store, so you would almost think that you would be in the perfect hands, right? Even though dad was this kind of stay-at-home drunk. And you're right, we don't get a lot of info about him, but I think maybe that's because she didn't have a lot of info about him, What do y'all think about that? The family dynamic, absolutely, we gotta dive into that. I'm very eager actually to dive into kind of how we get to the last chapter, the last pages. But does anyone else want to chime in?
I want to say that, well, I agree with the both of you because the fact that she opens up with something that could have been a major obstacle to her, but what I got from it is that somehow she managed to go beyond that level. And even today in our society, people don't know the difference between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. And of course, there's something else going on here that I had to look at. What is it like when you are an ethnic child in the United States? And I had to ask myself, what would it have been different if she would have been a white Anglo-Saxon child? I had to ask myself that, okay? Because you're right, it doesn't matter if your mom is a nurse or are the facilities and sources there. And if you notice in that chapter, when they did find out finally that she had type 1 diabetes, because it took them a while to diagnose that, now they're trying to pass it on. One sentence that stood out was when they say, oh no, that must be from your side of the family. Oh, that definitely doesn't come from my side of the family. So that is the part that really stuck to me.
Yes. And but then, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but yes, what does right after that, what does her grandmother say? Like, oh, I have some herbs for that. You don't need those needles. Like, I have some herbs for that.
Yes. Well, but that's
they don't work.
common, especially among ethnic people. I mean, I'm sorry, but even in my own personal background, if we ever had something wrong with us, it would first be your aunt or your uncle or your grandmother that will come with those herbs and give you, gee, I must have drank every single kind of tea as a child, okay? And after all that fails is when they decide the last alternative is usually go to the doctor. When it came to us, especially as children, it happens even now with COVID. Yes, it does. Okay. Oh, drink down some vinegar. Oh, you hear what everybody's saying about COVID. Oh, drink enough ginger down. Oh, make sure you disinfect yourself by drinking enough alcohol, or drinking warm things, or putting, somebody told me that if you eat salt, that's going to kill the COVID. Look at all the myths that are happening now. So it's and I'm sure it's common, again, especially in a lot of ethnic communities, because not that there's anything wrong with it, but I remember, hey, if you told my grandmother you had a stomach ache, she had every single kind of herb and tea that she would first give you. And then if it doesn't go away, is when you were sent to the doctor or a nurse, when all hope had failed. So that's actually, it's a part of the culture, and it's actually a part of maybe the trustworthiness that unfortunately ethnic people just don't have that same kind of relationship with the medical profession. Ooh, and that's what I got from it.
Yes.
They used to call it, I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead, Ron.
They used to call it the sugar And the idea behind it, behind all of these herbs and teas and soups, was that if you just thinned your blood, the sugar would somehow dissipate out of your system. Like you had too much sugar in your system. And it's just, I'm not gonna say it's weird, the belief system, but it is sort of counter to what we know now. But for many generations, this is, these were the quote unquote remedies to things like diabetes and sugar and
Yeah.
maladies like that.
Yep. There's this wonderful Chris Rock bit where he says, like, when I was growing up, I don't care how sick you got, like my mom wasn't ever going to take you to the hospital. Or he said his dad believed that Robitussin, which he called Tussin, like cured everything. Like I could break my leg and my mom would like pour some Robitussin on it.
Or Vicks.
And then go take a nap.
And go take a nap.
Go take a nap and you'll be fine. Just go lay down and you'll be fine. Yeah.
We still have botanicals.
Yeah.
True.
Hi, Anna, how are you?
I'm good, I'm good.
So I just want to, I'm sorry, before you continue, so we have some new people in the room. Usually how it works is, we appreciate when you raise your hand, but you don't necessarily have to. We try to have this just like a regular conversation. So when you see somebody sort of finishing up their point, feel free to jump in and make your point. Again, if you want to raise your hand, that's fine, but you can usually just jump in just like it's a regular conversation you're having in your living room. That's it.
The only one thing that I wanted to point out before we even started with the book is that in the preface I thought it was interesting that she told us that she's going to stop 20 years early. So we don't go through her nomination or anything of the like, because she says that she's still growing as an individual. And I really like that. It caught me by surprise that she said, I'm stopping 20 years early. And she told the reader off the back, if you're looking to talk about, when the whole nomination, Obama, and being the first Hispanic woman to be, a justice, we're not going to get that because there's so much more of my story. And for her to tell us that and then jump immediately into the diabetes and her parents' dynamic, I thought is a good, it caught my interest immediately, knowing, okay, I'm not gonna get into that, so I know that, so I'm gonna learn about her, even though I knew I was gonna learn about her, but it set the expectations for the reader.
Yes, yes.
I think some of that was also self-preservation, because if she got into that time period, we could pick apart her decisions and say, oh, but you said in the book that you were going to do this. Oh, but we know from the book that your belief system is this. So I think, yes, I agree with you, but I also think that some of it was just preserving, putting a cocoon around her ability to make decisions without somebody picking up a book going, but you said. So
Right.
I just wanted to add that.
You know what, also that in addition to Ms. Linda, that, the first thing they teach you when you're writing a memoir in school is that pick something that you have already gotten over. Pick something that you can actually reflect on. Maybe the nomination, it was just a little too soon. It wasn't enough time had passed for her to be able to talk about that experience. And one thing I just wanted to point out in the chat, Sade asked, how is that different than bloodletting? Sade, do you want to chime in on that? I'm not sure what bloodletting is.
Oh, hi, I'm unable to join on camera and I'm like on my phone, so I don't really know. I can't see everybody, but okay. I have so many things I want to share. So like this ideology that it's like, oh, okay, why? Well, if you drain all the sugar out of your blood, then you'll be fine. That was our belief in our culture. But in European culture, people would just slit their bodies open and bleed out. And that was, you have bad blood. So you're allowed to just bleed out whatever is bad. And okay, no, that was accepted and that was the practice, but nobody condemns it and nobody talks terribly about it because that was a quote unquote European practice. So why, when people of color are doing it, it has that stigma?
I would disagree. I mean, looking back from where we are now, I think we look critically at both practices. That, you know, you can drink tea and get rid of illness, or that you can bloodlet and get rid of illnesses. I mean, you know, for centuries, we were dominated by European culture, and they were writing the history books, and they were also writing the medical books. So we took that as norm. But now, from the point of, from the perspective we are at now, I think we would look at both practices as problematic.
Mm.
Yeah,
And
because I
then-
think the bloodlet, sorry. Like the bloodletting, I'll be honest with you, I read them more. I read about it in my historical romances, right? I think that's when I learned, when I was a kid, that's when I learned about it. I was like, what? But because it just goes to show how long that practice has been about.
But putting leeches on the body doesn't go, it's not going back so far. They were still doing that within, into the 20th, middle of the 20th century, you know, so.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think it was Linda who was saying that the preface, it set her up. That reminds me too, I didn't even read the preface. So that I was like, I should have known going into it. And that like just the ideas of how a memoir is written. So that's a good thing to like take away as I'm going through it.
Yes, yes. Does anyone want to add anything before I pose another theme? You know, and starting in chapter 1, we kind of get a little bit of their family dynamic. We know it's mom who's the nurse, dad who is, maybe he's working. I couldn't really catch if he was working or not, but he was definitely an alcoholic. And then the little brother, and she goes to a Catholic school. She's in private school. And, you know, one thing that really kind of stood out to me in those beginning pages was that heavy, really heavy theme of like shame and guilt, and how no one ever came over the house. And, you know, they always went to other people's houses. Like there was literally only one person she could name that's ever even been to their house. And that it almost follows the book until Poppy dies. I would say that kind of heavy shadow of shame really follows her childhood. I think a lot of that, I think that was really, it was really powerful as a reader to kind of see how emotionally taxing it is to have a parent who is an alcoholic, not only on yourself and your relationship with the parent, but on your entire relationship just with the world around you. You know what I'm saying?
I think it's interesting you say that, because I think at one point she didn't realize until her uncles came over the level of shame that, quote unquote, that she should have, per se, right? You know, when you're that young, you don't understand that. You know, my father also is a recovering alcoholic. So, and I still remember those times as a 7 and 8-year-old. And I didn't really get it until, you know, there are certain behaviors that you see and you're like, oh, this is really not normal. But I think one of the reasons that other people didn't come around is like what you say in Spanish, you know, entremetida. Like you this grandmother who she loved and had such an influence in her life, but also the dynamics of two females, right? Her mother and her grandmother who, for whatever reason, did not like the mother and found every fault of her son was his wife. So if something was wrong, it's your fault. So, you know, that becomes a bit of the isolation, because at this point, we've heard about her father's side of the family and we have no clue about her mother's side until they go to Puerto Rico. So I think that's part of it too. Now, it's just not the alcohol, but it's like, I'll be damned if I'm going to be around people who I don't like, who don't like me better yet.
Well, also the type of shame that things that her father did kind of brought to her, especially the chapter where she talks about when her father was the one who gave the present to the teacher, and her father gave a ruler to the nun in school, but he wouldn't even let her know what it was, and the teacher opened it in front of the class. Okay, and she talks about the way she went crying all the way home. So her father obviously worked for some kind of factory. He did work, okay, but he probably made that ruler and put it in a box. And she talks about the embarrassment she had when the teacher opened that in front of the whole class. It was a number.
Yeah, you're right. He was like, he worked at a wood factory, or maybe you're right, a textile factory or something like that. But I kind of, let's talk about that, because I didn't get why she was embarrassed. Is that not a good gift?
Well, inside the box was a ruler, and not an ordinary wooden or plastic ruler, but a ruler made of some indestructible metal, alloy, no doubt invented to build rocket ships or bank safes. Remember that, yes, the Catholic school system,
Thank you.
those nuns did believe in rulers.
Yes.
Did anybody go to, I know I went to a Catholic school system, and it was I don't think anybody went to a Catholic school system back in those days without ever getting hit by a ruler. They just
Exactly.
That's
There
true.
was
He
some
made
violence.
her a target. He made her a target with that ruler.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the worst thing is that the sister would open up her presents in front of the whole class.
Yeah.
So the whole class got to see, and she talks in the book about the way she went crying all the way home that day. Okay.
And I kind of wanted, because when that scene happened, when I read it, the way that I interpreted it was that, like, he was basically telling the teacher to up the punishments, right? Like, if you have a new shiny tool that you can use on the kids. So that's,
Oh my gosh,
that's the way that I read it. So I was like, oh goodness. And this shame, like, and I also went to Catholic school, and I'm reflecting kind of too. I feel like shame is the way that they get the kids to behave. They guilt them into doing the right thing, not because you want to, but oh, God is watching you. And they're so like confined that like the 1 minute that you do something wrong, you don't really know how to like operate within that. So her shame, I kind of feel like it comes from the family dynamic, but it's also reinforced in school. So like, I think Myra was saying that was her norm. Shame was her norm. It was where she lived. It was where she thought that was normal. So
it was nice to get like a little bit of joy with the Saturday night parties that her grandmother would host. That was nice, like, to have that kind of interjected, because everything else just seemed so gloomy, so sad.
And I would never do anything like that. That's so sad.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that those parties, it's like just reading the first, background noise, the first couple of chapters, it all kind of resonated with me. I grew up I'm still here around the same area that she grew up in, Catholic school upbringing, the whole, recovering, well, in my case, recovering anyway. And then I think one of the things that made an impression on me was just when she talked about the library, and how she got lost in that world of the library. I live right across the street from the Huss Point Library, and that was, it was my world when I was a little girl, right? Because that's where you could go get the books. That's, back in the day when you had to go through whatever, the index thing, which was a pain. But it's just, they did a lot of moving. That it got sort of confusing to me where the hell they were living at one point. I just knew that it was all in the same area.
Well, this is how I broke it down. First, they were in the house. On page 24, she talks about they were in the house that I think was like a couple stories or 2 stories or 3 stories, and then they moved to the Bronxdale projects. And then when Poppy died, they moved to the house on
Watson, yeah.
and this is all before, so she couldn't have lived in the Bronxdale projects, which is now, I don't know if everyone knows, but it's now renamed after her. It's the Sotomayor projects now. So she could have only lived there for a couple years because, to my understanding, her dad died when she was 9. And even before that, she lived somewhere else. So yeah, you're right. That part was a little confusing. And
Well,
you know,
her mother goes back to school and now becomes a full registered nurse. And that gave her a promotion, a better salary. And that's when they were able to move into a better apartment. And that's what actually happened. That's when she moved out of the projects, because her mother's career was elevated. Her mother actually went to Hostess Community College and now became a full registered nurse. And that made the whole difference in the fact that her family would now have enough of an income to be able to go into a so-called better place. And she explains that in one of her chapters.
Yeah.
It is. I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead, Ron.
It is interesting that at one point, moving into the projects was like the promised land. You know, it's such a change in their lives because the projects are new. Back then, they were new and clean. And this is where people who lived in tenements aspired to. But then suddenly, once you're in the projects, it's not so clean anymore. And then they want to get out, you know, so it's interesting.
Well, let's not forget, the original projects were meant for the civil servant workers.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it started out, it was meant as the leg up, as the stepping stone. And then somewhere along the way, just things became really fast backwards.
Yeah.
She got to Co-op City too, right?
Well, yes, that's where she eventually moved to, Co-op City, because that's where, as a matter of fact, a lot of people who move out of the projects, if you do a survey, you will find that that's where they went, especially in the Bronx. That's where I would say a good percentage of them would go, to Co-op City, even places like Tracy Towers. It's supposed to be one step above from the projects.
Yeah, it was a come up.
Exactly. So it was like a common move.
The Mitchell-Lama houses, the Peter Cooper, all of Esplanade Gardens.
Wow, that's because it's like when you guys say that historical perspective in those contexts, you really think about like the policies that are in place, right? Like, so the Mitchell-Lama grants, those things happen so that people can get condos and help finances and you know, have their quote unquote be homeowners in a way. But it's like you're still kind of running to chase it, chasing your tail. So wow.
Yeah, I find that really interesting too.
I mean, there are all these external systems for Black and Brown people that no matter how hard you strive, there are all these communities that are redlined against you. So even as you progress financially and you believe, well, the projects are next, and after the projects, we're gonna move to the suburbs, but then you're blocked or you are restricted as to where, you know, you can move. So oftentimes, anecdotally, I think a lot of people just stayed where they were.
Yeah. You know, speaking of that, it's kind of really a good segue into chapter 3, where her friend, it's that whole chapter is kind of devoted to her friend Gilmar, who was moving, right? He wasn't staying where he was when his family were moving. And you know what, reading that chapter, I was kind of like, this is so strangely placed. And it's all about this guy who we don't even know. And her saying goodbye to him as he escapes, if you will, as he leaves, levels up. And, you know, as I read through the pages and through to chapter 6, although like that chapter kind of lacked any real scene of like showing a bond between her and Gilmer, or even how deeply she felt the loss of him. It really, I think what that chapter does, it kind of shows us that was her, that kind of lack of communication, that lack of vulnerability kind of shows us like what she did learn, right, from her own family. Because if you remember, they went to PR and her mom meets her dad for the first, her mother meets her mother for the first, or her father for the first time, and tells him her name. And that's it. Like he was like on his deathbed. Do y'all remember that scene? It was just
I think that scene came afterward. I think
What'd you say?
Oh, I think that scene came afterwards. And you're right. When I read that chapter 3, I was like, what's the whole point of this? But what I think in reflection, as you talk about it, it gave us her community, right? I think when, well, maybe it's me being a cynic, but when community was a community, because you saw how many people they walked around to and that they said goodbye to. Like, we didn't necessarily know that he was going to a better place in California. We just knew that he was leaving, but she walked him through who he needed to say goodbye to. And these people were important for whatever reason. These people were important enough that I'm just thinking they might pop up again in the story, maybe not Gilmore, but it gave us her community when I think community existed, and not in the sense that it exists or not, doesn't exist today. It is true. It was kind of randomly thrown in there, but when I think about it, well, now we have it might have been like a 2-3 block radius, right? But a 2-3 block radius to a child that age. I mean, God forbid I got off my block, but to this day, I'm over 40, everybody and their mother, those of us who grew up in the building still know each other, the school, and is that sense of community that you can appreciate if you're still here decades later. Sorry, I sound like my mother.
Start drinking that wine, girl.
But it also kind of shows, right? Like, think about it, y'all. Her saying goodbye to Gilmer like that, in a very almost kind of nonchalant way, and then her mother saying goodbye to her father, like kind of putting those two scenes next to each other. I think it really tells a lot about, in a very subtle way, it tells a lot about the way that she communicates with people and her level, or what she was at least taught in the beginning of her life about communication and intimacy. I found that scene very powerful. I think that was probably the most powerful scene. It's in chapter 4. Let me find it. In the whole pages that we read through the 6, that they on page 49, that very last paragraph, if you have the physical book, it's page 49. And she's talking about watching her mom, introduce herself to her father on his deathbed, and how much that kind of traumatized her, to the point where she says, like, I've carried that memory of that day as a grave caution. There was a terrible permanence to the state that my mother and father had reached. My mother's pain would never heal. The ice between them would never thaw, because they would never find a way to acknowledge it. Without acknowledgement and communication, forgiveness was beyond reach. That was so powerful to me. Eventually, I would recognize the long shadow of this abandonment in my own feelings towards my mother, and I would determine not to repeat what I had seen. Like that, I think there is something so profound, and that's what I was kind of talking about earlier, being able to be so far away from an event and then being able to write about it. Whereas being so close, something that happened maybe just 10 years ago and writing about it, or maybe even 5 years ago. This happened when she was a child. And I think you could only have this level of deep reflection after, 40 something years has passed. What do y'all think about that? Like that
It
was
gave
so
insight
sad.
into her mother.
What'd you say?
I think it gave insight into her mother to a certain extent, right? Because, you're meeting your father at your deathbed. And even that, we already have a perception of her mother based on her perception of her mom, kind of, I don't want to say she's cold, but she's kind of cold, right? Like, and she says that, this would carry on throughout several years and even into her adulthood. And here she's meeting her father, and even then she's showing no emotion. And I'm going to be real cynical here. Because it's like, it seems like her mother didn't even want to go, and she was being forced to go herself. So she was like, well, we're going to go because it's the right thing to do, right? He's dying, so this is what I'm speculating is like, let me wipe my conscience clean, meet with my child, or what have you. But even his response, but we don't know, right? We don't know how much this is her reflection of as an 8-9-year-old. We don't know. Duty over feelings. That is right. I concur. It was, she was doing her duty. And her mother made her go as part of her duty, not because there was any real feelings there, because, at your deathbed, I'm meeting you and I'm telling you my name. And we don't even know how much awareness he had, right? This is her recollection of it. He could have been, no offense, already gone by then. And that was it. So to me, it's just an indication of like you said, what influenced her later, but it's giving us a lot of her mother, her perception of her mother and what has influenced her mother, because at this point in the book, we've learned so much about her perception of her mother that this is just another nugget that we're getting.
And it just brings me to like how many other families are also in this position where it's like, this is the way that I know how to grieve. This is the way that I know how to cope.
Mhm.
I just keep on pushing on, pushing on, pushing on. I haven't been taught to deal with my feelings because that's just something that it doesn't happen. Because like I'm skipping a little bit ahead to like the funeral and stuff, but like for when she says, oh, I had to do 3 rosaries, to her as a kid, it's like, oh, I had to do 3 rosaries. It sucks. But it was also too like, this is how we cope and this is how we do it. Are we, after we say these 3 rosaries, is something magical going to happen? We don't know. Or we believe, not to, talk about religion or, insult anyone's religion, but that's kind of the vibe that I was getting from it.
Well, the rosaries are traditional within a lot of Latino families. I can't speak for the other cultures, but I just think that the father and mother just coexisted after a while, because he is drinking, maybe not in front of the kids or whatever, but he does have a problem with alcohol, and the mother is just putting up with it. She's just, it's like, they're married and it's, father, mother, and it's just titles, and they're trying to coexist within the family, and she's getting the brunt of it. Sonia Sotomayor is getting the brunt of this dynamicism that she doesn't want for herself if and when she gets married, and a lot of families do that. A lot of people stay together for the kids, and they sacrifice a lot of stuff. So, it is sad, but it does happen throughout generations, and it continues to happen, and it will happen, and it will never stop.
Well, until someone breaks it, right? That's what people would talk about when they talk about like generational curses and breaking them, and I think that, man, it's really deep, to kind of see this on the page. I wasn't, to be in the position that she is in our society, Ms. Sotomayor, like I was not expecting her to take us there. and that level of kind of peeping into her life in such a vulnerable way. I wasn't ready for it. I thought this was going to be a cookie cutter book that was going to be, very framed, very carefully, and it is not. That is a hard thing to admit, that your mama met her daddy on his deathbed and had to tell him her name, not because he had dementia, but because he did not know her. That is some right there. That is a deep level of family trauma that most people will never recover from. And I think Sade is dead on when she says, so many other families go through that. And, it's almost like, where do you even start healing from that? Especially when, Papi died and they didn't really get any closure. They didn't really get a chance to see him go through recovery. They didn't really get a chance to see him get better, or to at least, try to help him and fail a bunch of times. He just died. So that kind of grief, that funeral scene it's a bit outrageous, isn't it? Like, everyone's so sad and crying and jumping in the grave, and people are speaking in tongues and spirits. But to my understanding, Papi rarely even showed up to the Saturday night parties. He rarely was even involved in any of their lives. I found that very, very odd in a way. And I know she talks about it a little too, as her reflections, like, why is everybody so sad about this? We don't even know this guy.
He's still her father. Come on. He cooked for her.
I think, God forgive me, but I also think it's hypocrisy at its finest, because I've seen it. It's just like, you're celebrating life, but then sometimes you glorify, when people are gone, you glorify these individuals, and sometimes you didn't really like those individuals when they were around, right? Or some of it's guilt to a certain extent, right? If somebody passes away and you don't really understand it, and you feel you could have done more. But I also think is showmanship. I hate to say it like that. I mean, I think there was honest grief in some of it, but there's also, it's a show, right? Like, who's gonna mourn the biggest? Who's gonna be out there and, throwing themselves and, all that kind of stuff. I'm a little cynical, like I've said, but I think, tan bueno que era. Yeah, that's very true. And that means, what a good guy he was when you were just talking shit about him the other day, right? So it's just hypocrisy at its finest, and it happens a lot.
Yeah, or
that's
not.
all I'll say.
Or not.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
There's this thing in I heard this joke in Jewish culture, which is much different. It's like literally the complete opposite. Whereas if someone didn't like you in real life, they don't make a fuss at your funeral. And there's this joke that it says, like, there's a funeral and all the families are there, and the priest goes up, or the moral, and he's like, hey, does anyone have anything to say about the deceased? And like, no one says anything in the synagogue. And then he's like, nobody has anything to say about the deceased. And then someone raises his hand and goes, his brother was worse. So it's like literally the complete opposite. So it's so interesting how different cultures kind of cope with their dying, the people who have died, because I find it very odd that mommy, especially at the end of the book, is, so grief-stricken, kind of isolates herself to her room, where they don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't even think her and Poppy were sleeping in the same bed.
They weren't.
Sonia was sleeping with
He slept
her
with
mother.
the son, and the mother slept with the daughter.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, this is still her husband, the father of her children. And I think she probably herself didn't expect, because even Sonia, at one point, she said that she thought that she would initially feel relieved because she wouldn't hear the arguments anymore. But then she realized, no, I miss my father. He's the one who cooked for us. So I think there's something about that relationship that, I always think that some children think their parents' relationship is their own, And it's not, there's something about that relationship between her parents that she's not, that she doesn't have a perception
She's
to,
not
doesn't have
privy
an
to,
idea of.
she's not privy to their courtship
That's the word.
or anything
the
that
word.
happened before
Yes.
they arrived. Your kids think that your life begins with them.
Yes.
And,
That is-
you know, I mean, these people, they courted, they fell in love, and then something went wrong. And Sonia and her brother have only seen what's gone wrong.
Yeah.
So I didn't find it odd that the mom was
Yeah.
so taken aback by this, because it sounds as if she didn't even think he was going to die right away. I mean, the way they described. So that was like a shock. And as someone said earlier, they didn't get a chance. I think Brandon said they didn't get a chance to see him try and fail or to help. So in many ways, even though they saw deteriorating, it was a shock to them.
Yeah,
And
it's very
they probably thought they had
abrupt.
more time.
Yeah, it's very abrupt. I had an uncle who died of cirrhosis when I was 9 years old. And my cousin, his daughter, was grieving in such a way that people who didn't know found it unexpected. And even my aunt, because of the issues that they had surrounding that. But that didn't take away what that person meant to them.
And he was the affectionate parent, from what she said so far.
Yeah.
He was the one that, you know, hugged and was the caregiver. So they lost a lot.
Yeah.
You find out a lot in weddings and funerals.
Yeah.
Yes. I really appreciate. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Because yeah, you don't realize it. Like that was their team. And it's like, what are you bringing to the team? Like that's one less thing that I don't have to do. I'm a working parent who I have to ship the kids, move them, figure out where they're going to go. If they get sick, if they get a doctor's appointment, but that's a stable thing, food and a physical body being there. So we kind of forget about that. And it's something that's missing. So now we kind of have to piece together, and she's going to have to think about not only the logistics part of it, but again, her feelings, which I don't even think that her feelings are going to come into play because she's going to be so ingrained in the logistics.
Yeah. And it's funny because you're exactly right. She changed her logistics, right? She worked in the evenings, and she said, my mom changed her schedule, but I didn't see her. It didn't change anything, really. She didn't see her any more than she did when she had the night schedule.
But she wasn't the only one. Mom wasn't the only one who was, you know, really kind of changed after Poppy died. It seems like so did the grandmother. She says she stops playing the numbers, and they stopped the Saturday night hangout stopped. She stops going to the bodega and to get the chickens with her. Like all of that stops. And even I thought it was so telling, that line she put in about how that the week after Poppy died, she didn't play her numbers, and the winning number turned out to be like a number on his gravestone or something like that. So it seemed like everyone took it really harder than I think maybe we would have expected, and harder maybe even than they would have expected if it didn't come so soon. And it's weird how grief happens like that, because you sometimes, you know, especially if someone really binds the family together, if they're the strongest in the family and they die, usually it brings everyone closer together, or sometimes it makes people even more distant. But with this case, since Poppy wasn't that at all, he wasn't the strongest in the family, he wasn't the one that binded everyone together, but it kind of seemed like in his absence, it didn't matter. What he was doing when he was living really didn't matter, because the grief was still the same, as if he was that kind of center point.
A mother never thinks she's gonna outlive her child. So, you know, my mother went through that when my brother passed away, and it just stays with you, you know? She wore black you know, forever. So it's very odd and strange, you know, to outlive your children.
Mm.
You know, the other thing that's interesting, even though from a distant perspective, if one were analyzing the family dynamic, he clearly did not have it together. So he was arguably the weakest link. But you know that old expression, the weak pull down the strong. And he was the man of the house. All those cultural norms kick in. He really was the man. There's a lot of Hamlet, a lot of Oedipus, in my opinion, in this. He was the main man for his mother. He was the main man for his wife. Yes, he was imperfect. Who is not? He was theirs. And when he was gone, wow, what a void. Powerful stuff.
Yes, yes, yes. I just love those last 2 points that Francis and Miss Anna just made, because, you know, you're right. Like, being that idea of being there is so important, right? You know, one of the last books we read, I don't even remember the title of it, but the father was basically when I was Puerto Rican. When I was Puerto Rican, and how the father, we had many a debate, those who were here, about how the father was not really around at all. And his absence wasn't really felt because he wasn't there. And this Poppy in this story is there, even though with all of his flaws, at least he's there. You know, at least he is not only there, but at least he's bringing home a check, some type of check, and he is cooking, and he is a presence, even with the arguments, even with the alcoholism. It seems like, you know, that idea of being there with your flaws is almost better than not being there at all.
Yeah,
I
he
think one
was
thing they both had.
comfortable.
What? Well, I was going to say that they both, the men, I mean, they both, doesn't really matter. You could be Puerto Rican, you could be whatever. I think both men had the same level of pressure, right? To be the man of the family. One had, you know, one was a womanizer for all, you know, for all intents and purposes. And then one was an alcoholic, you know, both are, you know, which one is worse, right? One is abandonment because you have several other families to spend time with. The other is abandonment, even though you're there physically, but there's still abandonment when you're going into the closet or you're going somewhere to take a nip. And then she looks back, you know, I thought my dad was doing X, Y, and Z, but he was probably taking a drink around the corner. It just seems like these men had pressures that they didn't know necessarily how to deal with it. And then you have the stereotypical Latin household machismo stuff related to it, that you're supposed to be the breadwinner, you're supposed to be the head of the household, and you have a lot of noise coming from different areas.
You know, when you said that, Brandon, in your follow-up, Myra, I hope this is not an indictment of the selection process, but almost every book that we've read that is written by a Latina or Latino, we read in person, we read a book by Justin Torres called We the Animals. All the fathers have issues, you know, all of them in Americana. There were issues. We the Animals, there were issues. I don't know if that's a reflection on my selections or the theme, the constant theme in Latino literature when it comes to, at least when it comes to men. You know, even the book My Sister, the father was a little better in that. He was a good guy in that one, but even he was painted as the person who sort of kept Marisol out of the home, you know? So I don't know. I mean, maybe that's how we portray men in literature and in society, or maybe that's just how men are, and books are just reflecting that. Some, yeah.
Well, I
But
think
it's just
so
interesting,
easy.
the theme. I'm sorry,
It's-
go ahead, Francis.
Yeah, I think it's so easy to make men the heavy because they're the ones with the power. They're the ones perceived to have the influence, the weight, the cachet. And in fact, on paper, they do. But then the failure to deliver with all that agency that ironically turns on them and cripples them. And they have no support system because they're king. The king can never show weakness. The king can never ask for assistance. The king can never bloodlet. So the king is a victim of his own perceived agency, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Point.
Absolutely. Great point. I'm sorry, Francis, have you ever joined us before? I'm sorry if I just don't remember, but.
No, I'm the virgin in the group. This is my virginal appearance.
Well, thank you so much for coming. It's very nice to hear your voice and to hear that perspective, because, you know, maybe to Ron's point, that's why we see this theme, right? That's why we see this theme of it. Maybe it could be partially because of the not you know, taking any weight off of anyone's own personal responsibilities, but that idea that Ron mentioned, that kind of the theme of a lot of these texts that we read, the father has fumbled his place in the family. It possibly is perceived as a fumble. We, at least in this book club, we really, I don't know if we've ever given the father, except Ron and some of the other men that show up, I don't know if we've ever given the father his full flowers, his full benefit of the doubt, and his full place in society as a human, not only as a king, right, but as a fully developed person. I don't know if we allowed the fathers to show as many flaws as we have shown the mothers, or maybe it's the way that they are written, right? Maybe it's the way that they have been perceived by their own families that we believe it. Like, if this is what your daughter is saying about you, if this is what your son is saying about you, it must be true. And we don't take into consideration their lives before that, because like someone said earlier, you think your parents' lives start with you. And it really, it truly is a disadvantage, right, to the mother or to the father.
And you know, excuse me, Brandon, I wanted to pick up on your point. I think there's a lot of sleight of hand here going on. On the one hand, I absolutely get your point. Wow, what an opening scene. You know, this appears like the gloves are off, the pants are down. This is total exposure. Where can we go from here? But sideways. But there's, I think, a deeper thing here at first blush, that there's no penetration, insight, revelation, or impulse suggested to find out who were each of these central figures in her early development. Who were they really? Now, I know action and inaction speaks words and mountains, but she's not giving us a full flush here. This is a very adroit, in my opinion, sleight of hand. These are almost archetypes that somebody could cynically draft and say, okay, South Bronx, this period, this is what they look like. It's almost like a rap sheet.
Almost like she hurried up and got to the point. Like, you know, the alcoholic dad, you know, the ice cold mom. I don't have to spend too much time there. You were absolutely right.
Right. So I'm looking for love goes deeper, in my opinion. You want to find out where were they coming from. In her quote unquote quick sketch of each of these human beings, what I'm learning the most about is her and her drive, no matter what's going on around her, to overcome.
True, like Esmeralda Santiago overcame also. So they're not. And then what about the families that don't have the fathers at home? So these are things that happen. I mean, I don't totally agree, but you know, like, you're not going to dwell on it. Like, she started talking about her diabetes. She got it. She presented it. She didn't dwell on it. You know what's going on. They're talking about the mother, the father. She got, you know, a whole lot to talk about. And yet she doesn't talk about, as I think might have said in the beginning, or Hendon, she doesn't talk about what, you know, Obama sanctioning her into the Supreme Court. So, you know, these are things that really happen. She doesn't have to flower it up. She doesn't have to do anything. It's a memoir, like we said about Esmeralda Santiago. Things are remembered, and there are things I want to write about, and there are things I'm not going to write about.
Yeah. Right. And of course, the most difficult thing for any writer is to write the truth. That is always the most difficult. But that is where the beauty is. That's where the humanity is. That's where you and I are. That's where we find the reflection. That's where we find the community and the inclusion and the power of diverse experiences. If you're going to write a memoir, you know, I understand there are a lot of politics involved, of course. There's marketing, there's branding, there's pitching, there's portrayal. But if you're going to write a memoir, why betray yourself?
You know, Ron actually makes this point often about memoirs. A lot of the memoirs that we've read is that how truthful are they? You know, because it is difficult to write yourself in your truest form, showing everything. It is very difficult. It's easier for you to tell the story that you want to tell, right? Which is also the benefit, right? It's a benefit of writing a memoir, because you do get to tell the story you tell. But how often are we telling the truth exactly how it was? I think that, you know, especially in this book, like the pages, for example, that we've read, to my understanding, she was only up to 9 years old, right? Yet there are these really deep philosophical lines and these rational, I mean, she even describes herself as a very rational child. And I'm just, I don't know how much I believe that, you know?
And that's a tool you find in so many memoirs, that people write with their adult brains, and they're trying to write about their childhood, so they're presenting themselves as 7 years old, and you think they're like Einstein because they seem so cognizant of the world around. Like, I could not honestly speak eloquently about my pre-tweens, you know, and
I bet you could.
I could.
If you put your mind to it.
Yeah,
But
and then
I could employ the same tools that
without
they're
growing
using.
the.
But to be fair, she's also talking, and you're right, right? She's writing from her adult perspective, has a whatever 50-odd-year-old woman, but she's also talking about certain moments in time, right? She's talking about her grandmother's parties on the weekend. If you do that every Sunday with the same family members and the routine doesn't really change, I think you could sort of remember that vividly. She's talking about the time when her father died, not only because it's her father, But that, I mean, my uncle died when I was 9 years old, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. It was Mother's Day. We were coming from church. My sister was yelling out the window. Theo had just died. That leaves a certain impression, and you, years later, whether you're writing about it or not, you're remembering certain little things about that day. Why was it, you know, you're not going to remember it as a 9-year-old, but you're going to remember like the grief you saw. You're going to remember certain instances. Yeah. So to me, yeah, she's writing as an adult, but she's talking about certain instances, right? Like if you see the fight that her parents, this was repetitive. Again, she's going to remember, there are certain details that I remember of my parents' fight when I was that age that you wouldn't want a child to remember, but it made such an impression that it doesn't really matter, right? I could barely remember my kindergarten graduation, but I can remember scaring the bee lights out of my cousin because of wearing a Wonder Woman mask, right? So there are certain things you're gonna remember.
It's true. She brought me back to Southern Boulevard, Kelly Street, Father Gigante, St. Athanasius. She brought me back, and then I see she was born a day after I was born. So we're like, I said, I must have bumped into her, you know? So I don't care what you say about this memoir. It's true. But like Maida said, you're not gonna get into every little detail, you know? Because it's true, everything stays in your mind. Those funerals that you went to when you were younger, you know, people were crying, and those people that were overdoing it, why are they crying so much? You know, it's like, but thank you.
Do you want to chime in? You wrote just one word, trauma, in the chat, because I think that's a really important point. That I don't think she describes her experiences, at least in these pages so far, as being traumatic. But I think that as far as memory is concerned, trauma is a very important factor in memory, especially childhood memory. Maybe Sade left the room.
Sorry, I was frozen.
Oh.
I couldn't unmute. I didn't hear all of what you said, Brandon.
I was just wondering if you wanted to chime in briefly about kind of what we were talking about and its relation to trauma.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I was saying she remembers this so vividly, like to add on to what Myra was saying. Like, yeah, it is. It's the same thing. But it's also you don't, when you're a kid in those ages and these kind of we realize that you have to grow up a lot faster than you think. Like you're on your own, you're going places by yourself, you're moving to and fro. But like at that time, that was also the norm, and things were probably depending on what you think safe and not safe is. It was adult kind of, but as a child. Because think about now, if you were a 9-year-old now, you would let them walk to and from school? Probably not. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally get it.
You know, it's interesting to me, excuse me, Brandon, that her brother, remember, she was the firstborn, so it wasn't a firstborn male. So that was counter the narrative of the time. People didn't admit it, but they always hoped that the firstborn child would be a male for many reasons. And she clearly was not. Her brother came along very shortly thereafter in 1957, and he went on, and his name, of course, was Juan Sotomayor, same name as the father, Jr. He went on and became a doctor and an accomplished professional as well. It would be so fascinating to have 10 minutes with him about, hey, brother, is this the way it went down? How did you see it? What was your take on it? What was your experience?
Yeah, that's how it always is, isn't it? I know that I'll be telling a story like to my family, and my brother will chime in like, that's not what happened. I wasn't wearing a red shirt. You know what I'm saying? So you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
But I'll tell you one thing. I'll tell you one thing. Man, he gave them both a beautiful surname. Sotomayor. It's sheer music. It's
It really
gorgeous.
is. It really is. It's a great last name. And I know she was saying that her first name, Sonia, she had looked it up while she was reading about the Greek gods. And I think she said it meant like wisdom or something also very powerful. And she kind of clinged on to that when she was like, you know, a child, 9 years old. So we have about 9 minutes left. And I'm wondering if anyone wants to chime in, maybe someone who hasn't said anything yet. Any points that we missed or anything that anyone kind of wanted to add in. It'd be great if you could just chime in if you'd like.
Hey y'all, it's Jazzy. Happy to be back at the book club. What's up, Ron?
Jazzy.
I agree with Anna, like reading up and seeing like the street names and stuff. I'm very biased if it's anything that has to do with Bronx authors and Bronx information. So what makes this book special and is kind of cool to see how the conversations go is I grew up around that area, but I also went to the elementary school. So to be able to like read this book from someone that was in that area, that I went to the same school with, and now she's a justice. It's kind of cool to kind of feel like, okay, I could be somebody like her, you know, I could build something, I could have books. And it's amazing that, especially for the juvenile diabetes, she even talks about it in a children's book, so that it becomes more of a norm for young people of color, children, so that they could feel more comfortable. And even with the book, she even talks about all the differences that people go through. And it's not just diabetes, but each of us has our own little thing about ourselves, and that it shows and highlights that children have many things that are going on with them when they're at 6 or 7 and 8, and it doesn't make us odd, or it just makes us different and unique, and we all should learn about each other. So I think it's really kind of cool for a Latina to hear her story and to hear like kind of the beginnings of who she is, to see, wow, and how she kind of became a justice. And we know that she won't talk about that, but these are the little steps and moments in her life that kind of made up to that part, to becoming a justice and a lawyer and all of that. So I think it's kind of cool.
Yes, yes. Thank you for
I have something to say. I'm really proud of her for being a justice, and I'm really proud of President Obama for letting her do that. He was first Latina, and I have, you know, some ethnic backgrounds too, and I'm really proud of her. I think it's great that she's a justice. Yeah.
The right kind too.
Yeah, she very smart lady and nice lady.
You know, I wanted to add that her mother, may she rest in peace, died on Sunday, July 25th, at the age of 91. And the beautiful woman up until that age. And of course, Sonia, in my opinion, is also very pretty.
Yes.
Her father actually never had an opportunity to be educated beyond the 3rd grade. And so he took what he could get. And of course, as we know, it was as a factory worker. But the mother really, in her own way, climbed up the ladder of opportunity, starting out as a phone operator. And consistently, I think that's another piece of Justice Sotomayor's background, that I really love to see teased out of this for younger people, that at some level, the mother's ambition and ability to finally get out of the depression and out of the bed and open the door and reclaim a future for herself and her children had to be a conscious modeling of behavior that was instilled in the daughter and showed that you could get on up and move on up and overcome. So I think a lot of acknowledgement to the mother has to be given for her role in shaping her daughter's life. Thank you.
Absolutely. And you know, at that very end, I want whoever wants to, especially if you haven't said anything, you want to chime in. But you know, to Francis's point, that's kind of where we end these pages, right? Is with her kind of screaming at her mom. She like goes to her door and she's like, "What's wrong with you? You're like, you're miserable. You're making all of us miserable. Like, get it together, lady." You know, and I just find that, you know, I think that honestly, her mother taught her that, even though she was screaming at her own mom. I think the way that she was raised, just even within those, you know, 9-10 years, her mother was able to cultivate that in her, you know, that level of confidence to like, if someone needs that kind of like kick to keep going, that, you know, you can give it to them.
I think the other thing that made an impression on me, and I think it resonates sometimes, is that, especially, and I hate the stereotypes of this community, but when she went to Puerto Rico and she was surrounded by other professionals, right? And she said it in the book, professionals that you did not necessarily find in Bronx, right? Like an uncle or an aunt. Somebody was a lawyer, somebody worked as the executive secretary for, I don't know, like some city or the governor. But it's that kind of stood out, because sometimes you're surrounded by a certain community and you don't have certain access, right? And then you go somewhere else where it's almost like when you leave here and you go somewhere else where people look like you, sound like you, and it doesn't matter. And you see what the potential of what you could be, right? You may not see it in the US, in the land, or whatever we call it, like not the homeland, but when you go back to your roots, you see the potential that the US supposedly is supposed to give you, right? The land of the free and all that nonsense, God forgive me. Because regardless, the land that has an immigrant, right? When you have that immigrant mentality, you come into the US to have a better life, and you're not necessarily having a better life per se. And then I to a certain extent, I felt the same way, right? It's like, oh, they're a lawyer, they're a teacher, they're this, that, and the third. And you don't necessarily see that in your own backyard. But when you go to a place where everybody looks like you, sounds like you, and you see that gives you some sort of hope. Because she talked about it to kind of, it almost gave her a perspective of what could be,